During the Chaos Wars, Ral, the Warlock, creator of the Blood Towers, created a new species of shock troops by utilizing blood magic to fuse demonic essence with blood crabs.
All right, so a few things with this. I had this idea, right? Because we were pretty far in on the I think on the animatic, on the lore itself, and you know, we didn't have Ral yet. It was all text primarily. One of the first things I asked Eddie to do, I was like, hey, to get a sense of timing, why don't we get all of the text into the video timeline, just for timing and pacing, right? Because we were talking about shots at least, and the text was describing Kerakoos and DrBossKey doing the battle, and you know, the battlefield and a few other things. And so it took a few revisions to get there. And you know, like I said, we didn't have Ral at this point, and so we engaged one of our artists, Toby, and we're like, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking. You know, he's this kind of corrupted paladin. You know, let's see if we can get some speed paints of him. You know, really just like where can we get with just a few hours? Not, you know, because it's in the context of us trying to do a character like Kerakoos. No, we didn't want to have the whole animated short come to a halt while we did full production on the characters, right? So, and a couple things here that we wanted, that I was imagining. So one of the things was that you know, there was Ral, and Ral, which I told you guys the story a little bit earlier. So he's kind of got this corrupted paladin thing. So we did some really cool stuff there. You know, with Ral, we had this lightning kind of being called down. He was basically this general, and there were a couple things that were really important in my mind's eye. One was that he uses these blood towers, and the blood towers are these things that erupt. So he's like sieging this beach, right? The kind of this beachhead, and there are mountains in the background, and the realm's troops are coming to like meet this invading force. And the thing is that Ral is like this warlock, in that he uses blood magic on top of it. So these blood towers in my mind, they erupt from underneath the ground. They're kind of conjured forth, and then as the invading forces start to just kill all the flora and fauna, they don't care if it's blood. If it can make blood, it gets absorbed into this tower, and then the tower transforms the bodies, the other creatures around it, the ones that it hasn't killed, into these sort of like monstrosities. So, and that's kind of like the, you know, where I think those were really key shots in the way I was imagining that I want to bring together. And poor Eddie, when I say that this can take so many different forms. So I decided to roll up my sleeves, and you can see the blood tower here. I wanted to kind of get it this violent eruption thing, right? We got these heavy effects. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about, we got the matte painting in the background. We've got one character in the front Ral. And then I did some really, really basic and crude animation on with trying to understand puppetry and character animation. You only have, and they're like these spongy things, right? And it's because we're using in After Effects, it's called Puppet 2D. So you're basically manipulating the image and animating the images through manipulation, as opposed to like joints and having planes that you're animating. So I used it as a like, hey, this is what I want to achieve. This was probably around 10, 11, 12 hours, something like that. And then the other thing that I wanted to achieve here is I wanted the camera to tell a bit of the story. And so you can kind of see it here in that, you know, as we go through it, like the camera does all it is one large image. We kind of introduce Ral. I think the thing was a little bit too fast, but I wanted to capture some of his sort of blood magic and abilities that he's using to call forth. The other thing that doesn't read as well is that the rain itself, it's blood, but it's actually, I put it in reverse, but you know, whether it's going side diagonal up towards the tower coming down, the blood's actually being pulled from all of the dying and defeated creatures on the battlefield, and it's being absorbed into the tower. You know, and all these things were in my mind, but what we wound up telling storytelling wise, and it was very cool. Like I had Toby do a bunch of speed paintings. He hated all of it, like, because he's a very good artist, and so I just wanted him just to like, hey, just see how far we can get. He produced some things, and so I identified some pieces in this, and I was like, oh, cool. So I could use the camera to essentially, move it around in the 2D scene to then give focus on the different things that we were already talking about, right? Because we talked about the blood tower, we talked about the Kerakoos invasion, right? Here's all of the blood crabs invading, right? They're kind of like baby Kerakooses almost to some right, Kerakai. I don't know. You see sort of like the good dudes, but they're all generic, right? And then you have I went sort of like, you can see like here when we're slowing it down, the rain actually reverses and goes towards the blood tower. And then we just went these sort of like decal effects on top, like these generic. I thought they looked kind of cool. These like blood splatters to kind of accentuate the fact that, like sort of the rule of thumb for me is that effects, because we can buy effects and we can tune them and tweak them for the scenes and manipulate them through After Effects. Those give us more visual eye candy that help kind of pull the shots together as opposed to just static images. And so then I learned how to animate a 2D camera. I sent it all to Eddie. Eddie was like, holy shit. This was the opening shot, right? For the Kerakoos lore animatic. It pulled together like some of this high concept vision stuff. It didn't use any like final art, which was really interesting. And those were the things I think I was trying to achieve with using these as kind of a prototype. And I learned a ton from this. Eddie, do you want to talk about anything in here?
Even though it's the opening shot, it was I think it was later, right? That this was added in.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, this was one of the last shots that actually came into the animatic.
Yeah, and it's I thought back to the very first sort of like jam we did, right? And it was at that stage we I don't know whether you know this or not, but we only had Kerakoos.
Yep.
As a finished asset, right? So just kind of like looking at how everything that's like a web that's developed out of it, with RAL and like that. It's like, it's just awesome to see it come together. It's awesome to see the ideas that sort of like that connect from that seed that was just the Kerakoos finished asset that we were working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Zay, did you have anything else you want to add? Anything that was interesting here?
For me, this is actually one of the busiest scenes in the entire animatic. And it's likely because it's got so many moving elements and so many moving parts, which might tie nicely into Oven Feeling's question of what kind of software we use. So I actually just wanted to maybe touch on the software that we used just to bring this section of the video to life. I know you've already mentioned Adobe After Effects. What else though?
I mean, this is I think with Toby, he uses I think he's using Sketchbook right now, primarily for his speed paintings. Some Photoshop. I definitely use some Photoshop. We did some very, very rough outs trying to get like hey, what does it look like with the troops on the battlefield, of course. And then we kind of as we had versions from Toby, we also asked for him to cut things up a little bit so we could have like the background as a separate layer, and then we could move things around like the troops and sort of get that right like kind of scale and impressions. I also really wanted to make sure that I had a skyline that was kind of dark and moody and mysterious, and then we had a sense of color that came from Toby that we could enhance and use kind of as a basis for tinting a lot of our effects, of course. So those are, I think, the main things. Eddie, you primarily cut this together in Adobe Premiere, right?
The final renders was within Premiere, so that counts as part of the program that was used. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So then we have this shot, right? What were you thinking? What were we thinking behind this, Eddie? I think it was that Kerakoos basically he's kind of surveying the battlefield. So one of the things that isn't as apparent here is that as the war is being waged, and Kerakoos became the general of this army, that as the enemies were being slain, their soul essence and their blood were being absorbed by Kerakoos, and Kerakoos just became more and more powerful as he continued to invade worlds. And that power is what drew, he became way too powerful to be stopped by normal realms. So, and that drew DrBossKey to him. So we had a really nice shot kind of talking about him here, I think.
Kerakoos, infused with corrupted soul essence and given higher intelligence, became a mighty general.
So we did that. It was really important to have him, I think, surveying the battlefield. Every shot needed to have some effects. So we kind of did this fiery flaming, the battlefield's on fire. We used obviously and you can see it with the camera kind of doing a pan in, or not a pan in, but a zoom in, of course. I can't quite tell, but I think we have a slight parallax on that background image, right?
We do, yeah.
Intelligence
Yeah,
became a mighty
super
general.
subtle, but it just gives the whole thing life, right? Like, you know, and that's sort of the style that we're starting to craft here. Is like, how do you get a nice mix of effects, basic art that's being utilized together to then convey some shots and emotion.
Infused with corrupted
You know, all
soul
something that goes
essence
by in
and
just a
given
few
higher
seconds.
intelligence became a mighty general.
I always actually thought of that shot as a little bit after the battle. I don't know if I ever mentioned that, but there's no rain, right?
Mhm.
I imagine that fire is more like sort of a lingering sort of like burning of the carnage,
Mhm.
and he's looking over, right?
Battlefield wreckage. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I like that.
And it's kind of, I don't know, I always find it kind of mind melting, right? Like, again, here we are, we do this big opening shot, all right? And I think this is all actually where we had the tweet break as well. So this was a separate tweet. And then, you know, we're at 13.
Kerakoos, infused with corrupted soul essence and given higher intelligence, became a mighty general.
And then you have the introduction of like this big, you know, the big Kerakoos shot. Like, this is like one of the money shots, right? And we did all that. That's like 4 seconds. We put more time and thinking into how all this was constructed for a measly 4 seconds of enjoyment. It's a tremendous amount of effort, which is fantastic. But what I really like, right, is that it also sets up this mystery for, like, he doesn't quite look like the speed painted versions of the other blood crabs. All this leads up to then like the big reveal,
Given
right?
higher intelligence became a mighty general. Kerakoos is the Lord of War Terrors.
So, a couple notes for me. One of the ways that I did the vocal work, right, is on a show, as we were going through and doing some dailies and whatnot, I stopped and we did a read through of all the tweets that we made, right? Again, the script, we're writing a different script for the next animated short. But I did the vocal work. I did a number of takes to try to find the right takes. And then Eddie lifted those takes out of our stream because he already goes through all of our raw footage and cuts it together. So all the vocals were basically made like what we're doing right now. So, and a lot of people comment that the narration is pretty good. I'm air quoting that, but you know, and again, using the tools, and like we could have set up, like, this is something I think is worth talking about, right? Every time you set something up that isn't on the critical path of what you already do, means that there's an opportunity that you won't get to doing it, because you have to schedule it. You know, if I wanted to go into a sound booth or do a recording session, a read through, and then a saving of the files, and then uploading the files to a destination, and then getting Eddie the files and giving him each of the cuts, right? Like, it actually was simpler to say 4 times a week we stream together, and let's hang out, and we'll just do these takes. And so I did 2-3 takes of each one until I felt like, you know, I'm usually in my mind, I'm a little bit more self-correcting on tone and inflection, and like even in the tracks I hear little things that I would have changed, but you know, like we were able to get them, we were able to get an efficiency in the process, and that gave us sort of like the first level of vocal timing, because that, you know, if you read it slow and plotting, or if you read it fast and exciting, that has an effect on how many seconds you have for each of the shot. Well, you certainly have the time in between the sentences, and the overall like sections that we did, but you only have so much time before, you know, you can only stretch the vocals so far in between. So that was one thing. And then another thing is that, so this was the big reveal, right? So this was our very first boss monster. And we did this thing where, like, he's big, right? So he has these big legs, and he has a lot of space. Like, we could have easily pulled him into the middle, but in order to get a much better close-up of this art, our artist is fantastic. It was amazing to work on this stuff together. And so I think, you know, the choice to not center Kerakoos in the frame gives him a more interesting profile shot. And then, you know, getting close to the face, right? Like, we work in 4K resolution, and we do that so we can utilize art from very close up without it being terribly pixelated, but also from far away too. So, you know, and if we ever want to print Kerakoos shirts or something, we certainly could. But I really liked that we did the reveal and we managed to get this sort of like, again, you know, it's only a key image, right? And so in order to spice the key image up, so you can see here, right? So we went with effects for the eyes, kind of these flamey effects. The flames are tinted in the eye color from the base art. We went with this kind of like, you know, this noisy kind of circular thing for his sort of mind's eye. And then we also, because we had these really great like drippy bits with the saliva, we went with some extra drips
Kerakoos
in the saliva, and we went with kind of a slower animation piece there. But again, it's kind of that style, like all we had is one key piece of art, and I wanted to create just a little bit more visuals for the eye to catch. And they weren't supposed to be so big that they took over the whole shot. But they're very much about kind of bringing just a little bit more of that style and noise and kind of personality to the art that we had. So those are things I really liked about it. Eddie?
Yeah, that's something that I'm actually really a fan of, is subtleties that add up, that bring something like that to life. If you look at that shot side by side without those subtle sort of effects, it's the world of difference. But you know, it's in the background for most viewers, but like it really does bring Kerakoos to life in my mind anyway.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd also say that you know, when you have images, this kind of comes from the animatic kind of perspective too, right? So as we do this reveal, you know, making sure that we show the kind of tongue, it's a very short sort of like, here's Kerakoos, right? But he's actually moving up in the shot itself, right? So yeah, so just that's sort of the style that we're developing, and I'm glad that we're actually starting to think and speak more in that style.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was it for those shots. I really like that we did the reveal of Kerakoos.
Let's see here. Tony asked, what have we learned from making this process so far?
We have learned a ton. So I mean, maybe as we are getting better at directing and creating these things, I think it's important to like, we did this more organically in terms of establishing. There were a few things we said and we already talked about, right? Like, hey, we had text that was pretty much locked down. We had a vocal track that was pretty much locked down. So that helped a lot. These were anchor points that we could then do our visuals and redefine the visuals. Also because they were tweets, strangely enough, I don't think we'll completely go back in that direction the same way, but that only meant there was only so much you could get out in a single tweet. And then, we ended up at about we'll just call it 2 minutes, right? 6 tweets. It was about 2 minutes of content, so it was longer than I expected it to be. I think the other thing that I've learned is that I'm taking a little bit more time now that I'm not afraid of, like, hey, let's tap our artists for doing speed paintings. Like, we're not afraid of doing a speed painting because it'll kind of get us there, and we don't need every shot to be 100% perfect. I think that was a big factor. So now when I'm writing the script for the Gondas animated short, I'm already starting to think in established shots. I'm starting to, because I'm kind of directing the whole thing. So unlike a classic script where I would basically just write characters, scene, description, and then dialogue. Now I'm also writing a little bit stronger in terms of scene notes and what I want to see. I'm writing essentially part of the camera direction and shot exposure. And then I'm also annotating like types of effects that I want to try to introduce or to convey and sell some of the shots, because that's kind of the style that we're working on here. So those are things I've learned. I'm taking just a little bit more time up front to produce a script, and then from there we'll do the same things that I think we learned, which are get it down into a series of we'll get it down to some narration. So I'll read the script, of course. Let's get those vocal tracks, because they're very close. Like at that point, I consider those done. I think that's important, right? Get your writing done first. Try not to rewrite, because every time you rewrite, maybe it'll work, or maybe you have to change a shot, or maybe it spawns something else. So every time you have to go back, it's very Hollywood in that respect. Every time you have to go back to reshoot something, that's going to cost you a lot more time and effort, right? And then, also, I think this time around with the next animated short, it's then By having those elements in place first, then I think we're going to be able to iterate through it a lot faster. But also because we've established a lot more of, instead of asking the questions if things would work, we now know the style that we're going for, and that's going to, I think, expedite just the overall creative process. Those are things I've learned in this context.
I think, like, on a technical level, I learned a ton. I hadn't really been involved in a project of this sort of nature, right, up to this point. So, technically, I learned a bunch. Almost all of it was a challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also, in the same way, in a sort of inverted way, I also sort of learned from DrBossKey, like when to know when you're restricted as well. There's so much to do in a project like this that you have to know your restrictions, and you have to know where to spend your time. You have to know, I learned a lot about the process and figuring it out, and that's why I've got a little bit more hope that the next project won't take as long. Hopefully we can get like 6 characters done in a year as opposed to 4. But technically I learned a bunch. And on a personal note, I learned a lot from you, DrBossKey.
I appreciate that. Oh, well, I'm glad to be your first. And I think you hit on it, right? Like, sometimes you have to put forward constraints, right? Well, of course we could blow up everything and then redo it every time until it's perfectly what we see. But I think that I think in that case, we wind up getting into a vicious cycle where part of your brain wants to achieve, take on new challenges. Like I said, starting projects is the easy part, closing them is the hardest, right? So and sometimes the enemy of closing is not giving yourself enough constraints to work through. I think it was important for me to roll up my sleeves too, and really kind of put my mind in the space. I think both for Eddie and myself, and this is for like creativity in general, right? So for the opening shot that I wound up working on, I was like, okay, cool. Let's learn. Like, I'd already done some things in After Effects. Let's see if we can do like 12 or 14 seconds in After Effects. And it turns out we can, right? Let's figure out how to create a camera that moves through the scene, even though it's 2D. And so, and then some of it's like, every time you take a project on, and Zay would say this too, is that when you're trying to achieve something visually or artistically, creatively, sometimes when you think about it, the more, I call them tools, the more tools you have in your toolbox and experiences you've had where you've solved similar problems gives you more confidence to then solve those related problems, right? But you shouldn't be afraid in this day and age to if you're like, hey, how do we do a camera shake in After Effects? Well, guess what? Hop on the Googles and you go and you look for the tutorials and you go, I think we can achieve this. So sometimes when you're working with people, part of it is also, or challenging yourself, is just being prepared that you're learning how to make new tools, right? And the good news is that as more and more people do these types of things, the barrier to entry to using After Effects, using these programs, to using Photoshop, it's so much lower than it's ever been. And people creating content to help you learn how to make things is so much lower. So a big part of your creative process also is partially just R&D and trying to understand what you can and can't do. And then that gives you new constraints where you're like, well, we can get close, but we can't quite get there. Or it's going to take days to create this type of shot. Is it then worth really pursuing? Like, how important is it? And if it's like, it's a quarter second, you're like, okay, 3 days for a quarter second, probably not where I want to spend, a big part of our budget and time on doing something creatively. So just food for thought.
Kerakoos shifts side to side, tentacles waving with a focus on DrBossKey. Kerakoos says in a whispery voice, I can sense your power.
So then we did this series where it's the and they fight, quoting the George Lucas, right? Like I finished Star Wars Episode 1 script, and just for the record, there's a lot of and they fight moments. That's a quote for George. And I always think about that affectionately, right? He's like, I did all the other stuff, but I didn't describe the action yet. So you know, I wanted to, I described the action as like the tentacles are these things, you know, there's very much a fighting game esque element of the characters, you know, squaring off in my mind in the way that they work in the DrBossKey universe. I did a very, very basic drop of like the sort of like painterly style of them being on a battlefield, right? Like, and we kind of did this subtle gradient where it was more red on the right side, bad evil guy, more greenish and good on the left side, big moon in the back side, right? And then also like trying to get the right scale. I went back and forth with Eddie so many times trying to you know, in video games, you know, your character has a scale against the world. Like what can they jump on? What can they climb on? What can they, you know, like what can they hide behind? You know, how big are things, right? For the levels and the interactive objects. And then, you know, you also have then like how big are the monsters in comparison to the, you know, to the main hero. Like everything kind of gets designed around the hero, right? So and for me, it was really important to try to get, like, in my mind, these Kerakoos bastard sword legs, right, are they're about the size of DrBossKey, so they're, you know, they're squaring off. I would have rather had, like, I wanted to break the head a little bit and have him more looking at Kerakoos, but, you know, like, we didn't build custom art. We built the art as individual illustrations and then tech arted them together, right? So, but these were things I was kind of looking for. I went back and forth with Eddie. I tortured him with like, hey, let's see what we can do to actually cut these tentacles out and then make them move a little bit, which you can see here. You know, and we got a little bit of animation with DrBossKey on on his arm and sword. Like, you know, we were just getting to the point where we could sort of cut up the characters, but they're really rough. They weren't even really created for animation at this point. And these actually started some of the conversations about, you know, how do we're spending all this time and effort and money to build these characters. How do we get the most out of them within reason, you know, to prepare them for some animation, right? And to prepare them for their different key profile shots, right? And to prepare them for like their special attacks. How do we tell this really neat story and basically what turns out to be about a half a dozen illustrations, and then cutting the key illustrations into cutting them into animatable elements, right? So even before we had an animator, which we didn't at this point, we do now, which is great. We had Eddie and we had our, you know, myself, and that was about it. But I felt we could do that. So that was kind of that was really, I think there was two things here. One, we did a lot of revisions on like getting the right, you know, and maybe Kerakoos is a tiny bit too big here, but getting kind of at least an established shot for them being able to do combat. As you can see, like Kerakoos doesn't even necessarily fit in. Eddie put this really neat, like, you know, handheld camera mode shake here just as a subtle shift, just to give the shot a little bit a little more life. We did some revisions to pull back and pull back in the effects for the eyes, right? Like, because we had so many shots. I did a lot of QA on the shots where it's like, oh, hey, Eddie, we need the effects here. We need the effects here. Like, these are part of the character. And because we did it in iterations, we actually had a number of like pickups where we just tried to pull a lot of the shots together.
Ellie had a question through when we rewatched. If we want to answer it, it is, what are your thoughts on the unevenness of the art?
One part of my brain screams that holy crap, but another part of my brain says just get over it. It's you know, it's an expression of art. You know, and I think we're gonna have some more of those uneven shots coming up more and more in some of these cases. But you know, I think you know, if we have one of two things, right? We can make an animated short and every shot can be at that quality level of this art that we're producing for like the main characters, right? And I think that that's a way of going about it. What would happen is that then instead of making an animated short in 4 months ish, we'd make an animated short once a year. Yes. And so I guess my thinking is at this point, you know, like I'm not out there selling them, you know, like they're fun exercises, and I think we're using them as learning experiences. And I think now that we understand more about how we are establishing the shots and thinking about things like speed paintings, I don't think we ever get away. I mean, I could technically take the refined and finished art for like Kerakoos and DrBossKey and then rough them down to make it all kind of fit cohesively. But I think that at the end of the day, as we build more and more art, and we still maintain, like, I don't see us building a lot of full production level backgrounds, right? Like I see a lot of speed paintings in the backgrounds and things like that. I think we can kind of find a nice narrative tone visually with effects are pretty well finished and big, so they're nice. The backgrounds are always going to be speed painterly. Characters that aren't complete, they're going to be speed painted, and I think that it's just accepted that these they're going to be rough, but we don't have the alternative of waiting months and months and months to bring those characters, and those characters aren't even they're like, most of the characters are the characters behind the characters. So while they will eventually get fleshed out backstories and things like that, they're not even big enough characters in the DrBossKey world to spend several months of doing I think development on. So that's kind of my thinking. So we did that shot there, and then we have let me see here.
I can sense your power. Finally a worthy adversary to bear along with the rest of the world.
So I think here, again, like for us, right? We have, I mean, look at this. This thing is beautiful. We have a high resolution. It's speed painterly. It's high. It's a very, very good piece of art. We have the effects that we carried through like we did normally. And, like in this case, Kerakoos is speaking to DrBossKey, and, like they're about ready to do and they're going to fight, right? This is the mano kind of thing. And being able to zoom in on his face and really pull that character through was really interesting. And I liked that aspect of it. Also, I think, let me real quick just look at this next shot.
With the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Snaps his vertical jaws.
So the other side of this, it's the Bob Ross, right? It's very much the happy accidents. So, when we first were working on Kerakoos, I was really into these vertical jaws, right? And I really wanted to have the vertical jaws. And then I had this idea, and this wasn't when we first created him. I had this idea where the jaws closed to kind of armor his face, with this kind of fleshy carapace, this hardened carapace. And then you just have his glowing eyes kind of exposed here. I really I get excited when when I get to create something like that with my artists. Like it really, really does it for me. And so since we had this, I really want to accentuate the art. Now, a tiny little thing. I don't know if you noticed this, Eddie, and we're not going to fix this at this point. But when we do the shot, whereas you can see like his face is closed, and then his tongue is still there. You see that? It's been bugging me forever, but it's just what it is. Sometimes you have to let things go. But I still, it's not the end of the world, because we just call it like a time delay kind of effect, right? But I really want to capture this aspect of the character, right? Like even his face, which is like this gnarly demon face, has a function. It has form, right? Which I really, really enjoyed. I thought that was really, really cool. And again, like we were well into, we'd already done fine lighting, I think, when we came up with that concept. And I think something else that I learned here, right, that I really enjoy is sometimes it's good to direct, right? Like I am fully in this place where I'm art directing, audio directing, I'm writing, like I'm creating the show here, and it's I me, but it's really our team. It's us working together, and it's trying to be a leader and to realize that you want to give vision, you want to give direction. Sometimes some of the most powerful things that I can do is say, hey Dimitri, hey Toby, I don't quite know what it is I want here. Here's some ideas, but instead of trying to force them directly into making those ideas a reality, I say, let's explore these things, do 3 or 4 of them, and then, come back to me, and then we'll use that as a dialogue to sort of like develop the concept together. So sometimes, like the vertical jaws, it took a few times to get there. All artists and creative types work differently, so you have to have a push and pull with that. But it's some of my favorite things are when I have confidence to say we're not quite there yet. I don't quite, and it's not a substitute to say I don't know what I want. I want something along these lines, but I want you to take an opportunity just to do an exploration, to do a design exploration. and then we use that we riff on that a few times to have good conversations about what's working, what isn't, and that helps get us through. Also sometimes gets us into this place where we find happy accidents. So those are kind of my food for thought.
I remember that was one of the last things that we did was establish that snapjaw, which I equally felt was really important for the character of Kerakoos, right?
Mhm.
But before that, we were just like fading through one version of the assets to another, and it looked janky and weird, and that masking the head onto the body, I think at the end sort of saved probably my least favorite shot out of the whole thing, and I quite like it now,
Mhm.
even if it's kind of gets stuck in his teeth.
I like, there's lots of things I don't throw you with, but yeah, I mean, I also know it was kind of a pain in the ass to get, and to kind of get lined up and whatnot. So but I know you learned a lot of things technically. I mean, again, these are, like, hey, I want to have this thing where we have 2 art assets. The art assets weren't drawn individually, so we had to do this thing where we lined them up a little bit. And it was good that we had them, but I know it was a challenge to get to a number of these things. And this was, this is probably, I mean, conservatively, Eddie, you're probably a good like 250 to 300 hours deep on this thing, I bet. Maybe about. That's my gut. Could be more. What do you think?
I completely lost track of time. There was one stage where I have no idea.
That's why I'm the producer.
I got a better job at this, keeping track of where I'm at. I disappear into a hole, and then I'm like,
Well, I mean, look, part of your job is to disappear in a hole. Like, sometimes if you're like, shit, I have to shovel all this shit, how am I ever going to do that? And the reality is grab your shovel and just start digging, right? Like, don't think about it too deeply whether, you need to. Ideally, someone's told you where you need to dig, and you just go for it, right? And then, if you get really stuck on something, then it's like, oh, hey, wait, ask for help. Let's talk about it before it becomes, a never-ending project, too. That's the other part of it, too.
Yeah,
there are a lot of firsts on this project for sure.
Right, and knowing when to do that is something that I feel I'm improving, I think.
Zay, anything from your side?
I was just gonna say, I think that with the limitations that we had, that we were able to, really push the assets as far as we could, only having the 2 different keyframes at that time. So I know we've got a little bit of a tongue slice there, but I think overall, Eddie was able to really work the images to give us the fullest of what they had to offer. And I know that he's learned vast amounts of things, from doing this project, and I can't wait to see how it goes with the next one. So